Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Chapter 2 Lifespan Development Review. This one will be over developmental theories. I will be covering briefly the psychodynamic theories. I thought it was interesting that they spent so much time on Freud, yet we won't be using Freud at all this semester. So you're going to see me fly through some of this. But Erickson, we will be seeing a lot of. From there, we jump to behavioral, cognitive theories, and then we'll wrap it up with talking briefly about humanistic and evolutionary perspectives. All right, so jumping into psychodynamic theories, and just a quick conversation on what is a theory. Keeping in mind that a theory is a well-developed set of ideas that are proposing why a certain behavior is taking place or what events caused it, for it to hopefully make some predictions for the future. So a theory often is used as a starting point to build a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a testable prediction. As we mentioned in chapter 1, we're usually trying to make a prediction about how maybe a certain variable is going to be affected. And so we look at cause and effect. So the independent variables, such as maybe a higher level of Ritalin and its effects on, hyperactive behaviors. That would be the dependent variable. So a hypothesis is a testable prediction starting from the foundation of a theory and often worded as an if-then statement. When we set up a hypothesis, it helps us in building our research design and selecting from all those things we talked about in chapter 1, such as, is it going to be a descriptive study, or is it correlational, or is it something we can actually manipulate and involve an independent and a dependent variable? And then actually performing the research, watching and seeing and collecting our data, and then modifying and how did our findings affect and come back to affect that theory. So there is quite a bit already that we've mentioned. We talked about continuity versus discontinuity, nature versus nurture. And also another key point that maybe we didn't mention last time was passive versus active. How do our early experiences affect our later behavior? Do sometimes maybe it's something that happened to us early, and does it cause us to alter the way we view things now as adults? So is it passive or is it active as far as our early experiences? There's some theories that you always want to consider anytime you're thinking of how we started studying, children, and then from there, the change in the conversation to adolescence and then adulthood. Adulthood research came last in the scope of things, and now we know even old age can be divided into all those sub stages. But some of the early scholars would be like John Locke, who proposed a blank slate, the tabula rasa, which said, every child's a blank slate and it's going to be written on based on their experiences and their exposure to different kinds of, events from their nurturing. So that would be John Locke's perspective. And then we have Jacques Rousseau, who said that innate processes and that these internal processes will affect us through stages and cause us to go into, like, we have differences from infancy to childhood and childhood to adolescence. And then, of course, Charles Darwin, who's known for his theory of evolution, natural selection, and that when we apply this to human development, we look at what kinds of behaviors make it more likely for us to survive, and do those behaviors get repeated among us, so parent to child, etc. Other scholars that you also want to kind of be aware of, Stanley Hall. You'll be seeing Stanley Hall really talking especially about adolescence. He spoke about like storm and stress when it came to adolescence. Another big name, Watson. You'll be seeing him being considered the founder of behaviorism. Freud with psychoanalysis. Gesell, which this large-scale, long-term study on biological maturation. And then Piaget, you'll spend a lot of time with this semester because we will be looking at cognitive development at all stages of life. Okay, so quick on psychodynamic Freud. You've probably studied Freud. If you're a psychology student, you've studied Freud in other classes. Like I said, it's interesting to me. They spent a lot of time with him in this chapter, but yet you're not going to see this come back very often throughout the semester. Because, first of all, his theory was not scientifically backed. And therefore, there's not a lot of research to back up his psychosexual stages that he proposed. However, I still think it's important to consider what he was saying. So, one of the big messages that he's trying to promote is that we are driven by our unconscious motives, by unconscious desires and fears and anxieties. And, he believed that childhood, 0 to 6, ages 0 to 6, was when most of these issues came about. And, if we had traumas, or we had great childhoods. He felt those were going to seep their way into us and into our adulthood, but unconsciously, that we wouldn't be consciously aware of them. He, devised a very elaborate theory of personality, the id, the ego, and the superego. If you've taken personality theory class, you hopefully spent a whole chapter on Freud. And like I said, this is not the class where we'll be spending any time really after this. That's why I thought it was so interesting. They give you slides and slides upon slides. And so I tried to just kind of focus on the big picture here. So one of the things he's arguing is that we have three parts to the personality: the id, which is very pleasure driven, immediate gratification. I call it like the little devil. The ego, who's stuck in the middle and is living in the reality principle, whereas the id is living in the pleasure principle. And then the superego, who is all about morality and lives in the morality principle, like, was it the right thing to do, and being our conscience, and guilt, and all the rules, following the rules. Obviously, you might be thinking, hey, some people might be more id driven, and other people might be more super ego driven if they're heavy with guilt. And so, yeah, he proposed this. It makes a lot of sense, and a lot of people love it. And of course, from there spawned all the defense mechanisms that he, proposed, such as denial and projection, and all those terms that you see people use a lot these days, which are not based in any actual science whatsoever. So, because of that, I decided just to kind of focus on the psychosexual stages and just kind of show you, even though recognizing that none of this was backed scientifically. Okay, so he proposed that there was an oral stage, which is all infants from 0 to 1. And at that point, he proposed that the id moves around our body through what he called the erogenous zones. And so in the oral stage, it's all about the mouth, everything going to the mouth. Then the anal stage, it becomes all about the anus and actually potty training and holding and releasing, defecation. And also as adults, he felt that we could be fixated. If a particular stage was traumatic, we didn't get enough of what we needed, or we were over controlled or punished severely, like in potty training, he felt that that could lead to adult obsessions like OCD, being obsessed with neatness, being obsessed with control. So, anyway, these are great theories after the fact. The problem with science is anybody can explain anything after the fact. Science seeks to set up statements and hypotheses that can project into the future. So can they predict the future? And so that's one of the things that science is seeking to do. And so that's one of the biggest criticisms against Freud, is that, anybody can say these things look great after the fact, but is this going to actually be something that will help us predict behavior for everyone? And unfortunately, no, it's not. So lots of criticism over the years. And one of his critics was Erik Erikson. Initially, he was one of Freud's students. Very briefly. He even he underwent psychotherapy, and he really initially bought into Freud's theory, but then he started pulling away and started recognizing, hey, you know what, I think this theory from Freud is overemphasizing sex and not emphasizing the psychosocial setting. So his theory is different than Freud's because he downplays sex, and he emphasizes the social relationships that must be present at each stage of personality development, and claiming, this is different than Freud's emphasis on the erogenous zones. Erickson identifies 8 stages that usually you're going to read about. They include things like trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt. You're going to see 8 stages that he proposed. Each of those stages is usually involving a positive resolution that can take place or a negative resolution, depending on what the environment was. And so he also believed that each stage was cumulative, that new stages would build upon previous stages and having successfully completed the previous task at hand. These psychosocial stages you'll be studying in detail. You will see them, divvied up across the life stages depending on where we're at. So in our first few chapters, you're going to be introduced to trust versus mistrust. Once we start looking at infancy and childhood, you're going to meet initiative versus guilt, and industry versus inferiority. And the adult ones, pretty much after adolescence, would be like, who am I? Right? Identity versus role confusion. Intimacy for young adults, right? Okay. Intimacy versus isolation. For middle-aged adults, generativity versus stagnation. And for late adulthood, integrity versus despair. So just kind of keep in mind that there's always some good thing that could happen in Erickson's theory and a bad thing that could happen. And it was dependent on, their psychosocial setting and what was available to them. You will be exploring these stages in much more detail as we go into the chapters. His theory has been, always theories are criticized, considered, never sufficient, and that's what yields and usually sparks another theory to come after it. But it is a good theory. I like it a lot. I like to consider Erickson's theory as a psychosocial map, especially if you have little ones, because it really shows you, like, hey, what should each child be doing at the various life stages? And it also, as a parent, what opportunities, what support should you be providing? So it is a really positive theory, I think. There's a lot, like I said, there's always a lot of weaknesses or criticisms, but overall, it is a very powerful theory that you're going to spend quite a bit of time on this semester. The next section that you're going to cover on theories is behavioral theories. So that would include everything from Watson, the founder, right? Moving on to Ivan Pavlov, who was the Russian physiologist who studied classical conditioning. And so if you've studied classical conditioning, you know that it involves associative learning, making associations between two stimuli. So an unconditioned stimulus is something that's unlearned, doesn't have to be learned, and it produces an unconditioned, unlearned response, such as food leads to salivation. Then the dog didn't have to learn to salivate to the food. It's just a natural response. But during conditioning, when we're trying to condition, let's say we're trying to condition the dog to start salivating to the bell, then we have to take a neutral stimulus and start pairing it with the unconditioned stimulus. Eventually, what will happen is the dog will be conditioned. It will learn that the bell no longer is neutral. The bell actually means food. And so when the dog hears the bell in the future, after conditioning, it will lead to a conditioned response, which is the salivation. And now it's a learned response because dogs don't naturally salivate to bells. So that was Pavlov. Operant conditioning involves Skinner, and B.F. Skinner was a huge researcher in behavioral psychology. He is the one who studied, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. These are all forms of consequences that we can receive after conducting a certain behavior. So this is very important in lifespan research, especially because a lot of times we become what we are reinforced to do. So, when our parents reward us for certain things, that's what we tend to repeat. Also, not just our parents, but our friends, our environment, our school setting, our work setting. So, a lot of times we are driven by reinforcers, and this is definitely impacting for developmental research. Skinner used a Skinner box. This is where he did a lot of his research on rats, where the rat could literally press a lever to receive a reinforcer through the little dispenser. And so, he did that research, but, he is one of the most published authors. He did over 500 studies. He has a vault, right? Consider a vault of research. And so when Skinner talks, you should listen because there is a lot of backup and data to back up his claims. And so this is one of the areas that you do want to know is very well researched. Social cognitive theory involves Albert Bandura, and he was the social learning theorist. A lot of times his research will be found in other content, like you might find his research in social work or in sociology. Some of the terms that he is credited for would be things like self-efficacy. If you've ever used that term, he was the one who researched that. He researched reciprocal determinism, and this is an interesting concept that says that not only do reinforcers affect our behavior, but that our behavior sometimes can affect our environment. And our environment sometimes is reflecting yes, we're positive and therefore we have a positive effect on our environment, or vice versa. If we surround ourselves with negativity, don't be surprised when you're having negative thoughts. And so that it reciprocates off of one another. And so make sure that this is a powerful theory, right? Observational learning, modeling, what we see from our parents. Most of us are, we watched our parents do certain things, and man, kids pick up everything. They're like little sponges. And so I can never, say enough on that, right? Okay, we're definitely, as parents, we are social models, and we are constantly exhibiting for our kids. And when you say like, do as I say, not as I do, because we can be hypocritical at times, right? And so yeah, watch out, because your kids are always watching. And there's a process for learning observationally. Obviously, if you're going to learn how to do something when someone is demonstrating something to you, they had to have your attention. If you're not paying attention, you're obviously not going to learn what you were hoping to learn. And you have to be able to retain it, right? You have to be able to remember it somehow. And then you also have to be able to execute it, do it on your own. And the fourth part is having the motivation to actually do it. And so this is all part of what can affect us when we're learning observationally. The cognitive process, there's a lot of key terms once we start involving Jean Piaget. And, Jean Piaget, you're going to spend, like I said, a lot of time with this semester. He is a developmental theorist that focused on cognition, which is how we think. Right? How do we make sense of the world? And so some of his terms, like our schemas, our assimilation, our accommodation, these are all terms that he coined and that are all very cognitive in nature. So what is it that we do when we see something unknown, and we have to come and put it into our head and categorize it with something we already knew in advance, or maybe we have to make a new category for it because it's a new situation and we've never seen it before. So if it's something we can just add to our existing categories, like it's a different kind of Mexican restaurant, we already had a category of Mexican restaurant in our head, and now we can just like add, and there's some that only sell gorditas, and there's some that only sell tamales. And so at that point, knowing, oh, okay, well, this place is only gorditas, but we go ahead and put it into our category of Mexican food restaurants. Whereas maybe you see something that you had never had before. Maybe you go to a restaurant in LA and they tell you they're a Mexican food restaurant, and you sit down and they're trying to serve you ant larvae and honeybees and crickets. And so those are indigenous foods, but you had never seen them on the menu. And at that point, you're expanding your schema to say, wow, okay, there's all kinds of Mexican food that I've eaten before. And then there's the kind, that was indigenous that I had never eaten before, and that maybe I never want to eat again, or maybe you liked it, who knows. But that would be an account for accommodation. All right, so the stages of cognitive development that you're going to be learning this semester involve 4 stages, and they are age-based, which means he projected that at these ages, these would be the stages that a child would be going through, or an adult would be going through cognitively. So the first stage is the sensory motor, the second stage is the pre-operational, third is concrete operational, and fourth is formal operations. For each one, you're going to learn, like, what are some of the limitations during that stage? What are some of the accomplishments during that stage? And so once you start reading actual development, cognitive development theory from Piaget, you'll see that oftentimes he's listing, the younger we are, the more limitations we have. The older we are, we're supposed to have, like, once we reach adulthood, we're supposed to reach formal operational thought, but you're also going to find that that's not always the case, right? And so, so this is just a quick introduction into Piaget. And there's, like I said, for each stage, there's going to be some accomplishments. Like in stage 1, sensory motor, you're all about your senses. You're all about, starting from scratch, like a kid, a newborn, a fresh bouncing baby boy cannot even hold up his own head. But within the first 2 years of life, he goes from not being able to hold up his own head, not being able to hold on to his bottle, to all of a sudden now he starts crawling, then he starts walking. Next thing you know, his parents are chasing him and buying a leash because they can't keep him. And so that's an example of sensory motor development. And for each stage, as you are reading about Piaget, he will always list some of the accomplishments, like object permanence is an accomplishment of the sensory motor stage, and also some of the limitations, right? So like stranger anxiety, which is obviously a survival tactic as well, right? And so without going into each one in depth right now, I'm just trying to give you an overview, because you will have a chapter where you spend the entire chapter talking about pre-operational stage, or the concrete operational stage, etc. So just keeping in mind that for each stage, there are certain accomplishments and there are certain limitations. All right, and so lots of criticisms, like I said, there's always lots of criticisms, but again, he is the biggest theorist that we have in cognitive research. Another set of theories that you also want to know is the information processing approach, and this one just kind of talks about how we have to, consider especially when we're talking with children, we have to consider that their working memory is limited, and they have much fewer, smaller memory bins. And so if we give them a long list of things that they need to do, they're probably maybe going to remember the first one and the last one, but forget everything in between. So the working memory varies as we mature cognitively. And so this is all part of information processing theory. Another part of it is, how is it that we get information into our long-term memory? And, is it there to stay, or is it a use it or lose it kind of thing? Hopefully in college, you're learning things so that you can put them away for now and pull them out and use them in the future. Hopefully you're not here just to pass the test and not know anything in a couple of years. We hope your degree means something, but again, it's going to come back to how much effort you put into learning, and how much you are willing to work for it, right? Okay, because it takes a lot of effort to go ahead and put things into your memory. All right, and wrapping up towards the end here, cognitive neuroscience is a newer approach. This is where we start looking at some of the factors that underlie cognition, such as the neural connections, the anatomy of the brain, the neurotransmitters involved in mental processes, for example. Sometimes we're looking at what's the location for attention or what's the location for memory. So like one of the most important memory parts in the brain is the hippocampus. And so that's more modern research trying to connect these behaviors with actual functioning anatomy and physiology of the brain. The last part here that you, as far as theories, you want to know Carl Rogers and humanism. He was one of the founders of humanistic psychology. Carl Rogers believed in the self concept. So, how do we feel about ourselves? And that, he said that we have an ideal self who we wish we were, and a real self who we actually see ourselves as. And if they don't overlap, he felt there was a lot of incongruence. If they do overlap, if who you want to be is who you feel you are, then there's a lot of overlap and you probably feel pretty congruent. You feel whole, you feel complete. But if there's a big disconnect between the ideal self and the real self, he felt that that would lead to incongruence and a lot of psychological issues that would come out of your incongruence. That's Carl Rogers. Another humanistic psychologist would be Abraham Maslow. And Maslow is the theorist of the most popular pyramid on the planet. It would be the hierarchy of needs. You have probably seen this many times in other classes, but just in case you haven't, there are needs that Maslow organized in order. He said that starting from the bottom, these are the most important ones that we have to have in order to function. And especially the bottom two, the physiological, like we have to have food, we have to have water, we have to have sleep, homeostasis. We have to have those things just to kind of function. Another thing is we need safety and security. We need to know that, we're sleeping in a safe bed, that there's not going to be anything that happens to us, or we're not going to be broken into at night. And so those are two of the most basic needs. And he said that if the bottom needs were not fulfilled, it would be hard for you to work on some of the higher growth needs. So things like esteem, or at the highest part of the pyramid, self-actualization, doing, what you were put on the planet to do, problem solving, being spontaneous, being creative, your most creative self. He felt you're not going to really work up here if you're stuck with issues accessing these layers down here on the bottom. So the hierarchy of needs is a way of organizing needs and saying some are more important than others, especially when it comes to not having them. Right? Okay, so not having food or water or a place to sleep would definitely be a crisis, as opposed to not being able to be creative. Those are more existential crises. And so, yes, this is where he organized the needs. Another theorist that you want to make sure you know is Vygotsky. Vygotsky is a sociocultural theorist. He was the one who coined things like the zone of proximal development, and he really was very interested in how culture affects development. And he felt that Piaget, he's considered Piaget's rival, and he felt that Piaget did not consider the social environment that children were growing up in that would affect their cognitive development. So one example there would be like, maybe you're a 3-year-old, but you have a 6-year-old sibling who is able to teach you how to use scissors. And therefore, by the time you enter school, you are a scissor pro. And maybe you are in kindergarten with kids who have never touched scissors. So Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, very significant, very important. I took a whole class on it in my doctoral program. I had to write a huge paper. It was very painful. But yes, big theorist, big theorist. And some of his terms here that you want to know. He was the one credited with scaffolding, which means, as a teacher, we kind of need to know Where is your zone of proximal development? And then also, how can we give you the scaffolds, the ladders to help you get to higher levels of achievement? And, when can we step back and not have to give you, this step-by-step process? The zone of proximal development is that zone where you're able to, you're not bored, but you're not in over your head. You're just at the right zone for learning. And, Vygotsky believed that it's important for adults to figure out where the child is specifically. That way they can target their teaching and their learning towards the child's needs and towards the child's unique zone of proximal development. The last theory you're going to hear me talk about today is Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. This one kind of combines the child, the natural environment, and also the bio as far as biological processes. So do we have the right functioning when it comes to something as small as neural functioning, all the way to the bigger picture? And are you in the right person fit? As a child, maybe you're highly anxious, but yet you're in a family that likes to do really scary, daring things, and you're already highly anxious. So that's not a good person environment fit. So here we're looking at all these systems that come into play and that have to be considered when we're talking about development. The final perspective that you want to know is the evolutionary perspective, and that would be the how is it that our gene code affects us, right? And what is it that you inherited from your ancestors? Maybe somebody told you, maybe you thought, I'm never going to be like my mother. And then somebody tells you, oh my gosh, you look just like mom and you sound just like mom. So, evolution is our gene code, those things that, we continue from parent to child, that we pass on genetically, and that we don't have much control over. I mean, we're just gaining. You got 23andMe, and you have people now learning their gene code, and it's much more affordable now than it used to be. But still, we are not at the point yet where we can turn buttons off and on, and exactly select what kind of child we're going to have. And even if we had the gene code exactly where we wanted it, that doesn't mean that's what the child would turn out to be as an adult. And so we have to consider, hey, there's an evolutionary perspective, and then there's this whole ecological systems perspective, and we know that they're constantly interacting. Right. And so the field of behavioral genetics likes to study looking at things like, what is it about behaviors that are actually driven by gene code? I thought it was really interesting to know that sometimes, not just disorders like schizophrenia and depression and substance abuse can have a genetic component, but so do things like being outgoing, being loud and extroverted. Those tend to also have genetic components as well. And so the field of behavioral genetics is alive and thriving, as you can imagine, and we will spend a little bit of time on that in class as well. So overall, you've seen lots of theories in this chapter. When you talk to a particular developmentalist, they might tell you that they don't have buy-in into just one theory, but they use all of them depending on what is relevant to the situation at hand. And that is considered being eclectic, an eclectic approach. And that would be probably the best way to use theories, because they came about usually because something was missing in the previous theory. And so to just have buy-in onto one will definitely bias you and limit your scope and your focus. So you always want to learn, first of all, why all these theories exist, and then secondly, how can they be used to benefit us as a whole. All right, you all, I hope you enjoyed chapter 2, and I wish you the best on your exam. Thank you.